Так, все буде працювати.
Уже працює?
Все, так? Ми тоді даємо все. Удачі вам.
Юлия. Юлия Кириллова. Юлия Кириллова.
Greetings to everybody from Kyiv, from the capital of Ukraine, the capital of indomitable people. We start our broadcast to present the research of the discrimination of different groups in the armed forces of Ukraine, the views of the military and the civils. The research was created by Ukrainian Veterans Fund, the Ministry for Veteran Affairs, in cooperation with NAKO, Independent and the Corruption Committee, and the broadcast is available at the resources of NAKO and Ukrainian Veteran Fund. The broadcast is in Facebook pages and YouTube of the organizations aforementioned. I'm Natalia Sokolenko, the journalist of Ukrainian radio. I will help our participants to communicate with those who visit this presentation. I will help in asking questions and answering them. In the beginning, I would like to thank Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform for their hospitality. Thank you, dear colleagues, for this wonderful venue, for the broadcast, and for the interpretations. So those who will need interpretation during the Q&A session, you may count on us as a Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. I will remind our speakers about the limitations so we catch up with the schedule and we can communicate with those who came to hear us or those who watch us online and have additional questions. Generally, everybody who has already familiarized themselves with this research, for them the positive news is that discrimination in the Ukrainian society, the situation is generally improving, and the issues which are researched in this study, in this sociological report, I'm talking about the attitude to the groups that may be subject to discrimination, like women, LGBT representatives, former prisoners, and representatives of the minorities, national minorities. Well, we see those changes since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. It's quite clear it's the natural reaction of the Ukrainians who demonstrated their unity, solidarity, but we have to continue studying this question, to what scale, to what extent those changes have happened, what do we have to do next, so that discrimination as a social phenomena can only be remembered as a thing of the past, so that we take diversity with an open heart and with understanding of our individual nature of every and each of us. So let's proceed to our work, to the beginning of our work. And I want to give the floor to Svitlana Berezina, Director of the Directorate of the Strategic Planning. You have about 7 minutes. If you allow an intro, I have a request to everybody who will take the floor. Let's focus on how to overcome discrimination and what has to be done, what are the further steps, and who has to do what to overcome the discrimination. So since the creation of the Ministry for Veteran Affairs since 2014. How was this issue studied in the politics? How was the issue of discrimination studied? What is the new that you want to implement in your policies? Thank you, Ms. Natalia. I want to thank the organizers, the guests, the speakers. It's my honor to be present here today during presentation of this important study. I will try to answer your question, but as it is usual for our state policy, well, I'll take a detour. Well, the veteran policy is being one of the main areas of work of the government, but in the context of this study that we present today, I would like to pay attention to the practical component. What does the Ministry for Veterans do for the veterans so that we accept our veterans with dignity, so they can reintegrate into the society with dignity? Using the results of this study, one of the priority projects implemented by the ministry, I think you've already heard about it, is the project of the Institute of the Veteran Assistance. So we studied the international experience, we studied the demand in our country, whether such assistance are necessary, and obviously there is no single scenario. Our veterans are already coming back, some of them need help with the, well, starting from the train platform. Some of them get back, reintegrate to their community, to their families in a normal manner. So since the beginning of June, we will start the selection for the veteran assistance. This project is gonna be implemented in 4 regions of Ukraine: Vinnytsia, Mykolaiv, Dnipro and Lviv. That's going to be a pilot project. We will study the economic capabilities, the number of veterans who will be engaged in the pilot project in every region. This is just an introduction. I will answer your questions a bit later. So we use the digital tools, and the selection will be happening with their help. We also plan to make interviews with such assistants to avoid further discrimination, to make sure that the assistants provide the efficient services to our veterans in an addressed and effective manner. And in every phase that the assistants will assist our veterans, their family members, and the families of those who perished. So they need the results of this study that we present today, because there is discrimination in the front lines. Maybe those facts are not so widespread, but they exist. Then as the veterans go back to their communities, we know about such facts too. They may be not so numerous, but they exist. As they come back to their jobs, there is discrimination arising, not because people don't want to accept their colleagues who were absent for a long time, but it's just because the colleagues don't know how to act towards veterans. And the Ministry for Veteran Affairs now organizes trainings for business companies how to reintegrate the veterans to avoid discrimination. The study that we present today, it will be very actively used during the creation of the policies that we try to implement now, because we have to base our attitude on facts, all that international experience, the demand by regions, by communities. It has to be corroborated. It has to give us opportunity to take reasoned decisions. So you give your minutes to the other speakers here, just like we agreed before. Thank you very much, Ms. Svitlana. So let's move on. Please take the microphone from Ms. Svitlana. Svitlana Musiyaka, Head of Research and Policy Development at the Independent Anti-Corruption Commission, NAKO. We have to get used to this abbreviation like NABU, SAP, NAZK, and others, because what NAKO studies, those issues are extremely important, specifically during the full-scale invasion, because they are related to the industry of defense and security. So the question to you, as a representative of the institution that was taking part in the organization of this study and research. So the topic of this research is quite clear: discrimination of the military in the armed forces. So what about the categories? What were the groups that you segregated, and in what manner? I already pronounced those groups, but maybe there were some that the resource was not enough to research, and they are still worth researching in future. Thank you very much for your question. I will really start with the information that we in our organization work based on the fundamental research. Any proposals, any suggestions as to the settlement of any issue, they have to be based first of all on the facts that we find out during our research. And I'm proud to have been able to coordinate the efforts of our organization, of the civil sector, with the representatives of the government, the representatives of the Ukrainian Veterans Fund and the Ministry for Veterans Affairs, and with the help of Sociological group rating, we now present this research. The solution of the problem, the first step in the solution of the problem is its recognition. We have to understand whether the problem actually exists, and yes, such problem as discrimination does exist. So, answering your question about the groups that we picked for our research, we were basing ourselves on the communication with the veterans, on the previous research we communicated with those who serve now or used to serve before in the armed forces, and based on their practical experience, we segregated certain groups that we have to pay attention to. As we used to say before, those are the women in the armed forces, the representatives of LGBT community, the representatives of national minorities, and we also added to our draw down such category as former prisoners, and we also added a number of issues regarding the social problems that were researched before, the problems with psychological support, access to social services, and it's more or less general picture, so to say, that will help us understand the needs and the practical challenges the servicemen are facing, the veterans are facing. And obviously, there are way more such groups that may be subject to discrimination. For example, we did not add there are people who live with HIV or other types of chronic diseases. They also joined the armed forces, and they have to overcome certain challenges related to their special status. What I've said before, and I keep reiterating, that there is a lot of work to be done, and we have to find out a lot more, both about ourselves and those who live by our side, so that from the vantage point of dignity, we can work on solution of this problem. So first, we have to recognize this problem. The second step will be asking those who are by our side, what are the problems, what would be important to solve those problems, and then we can all work together on those problems. When I say all together, I mean the government, authorities, civil organizations, the unions of people by different characteristics, like veterans, LGBT community representatives. Any interests that make people united are always better than absence of dialogue, and everybody has to keep working on their spots. We can do something by education, trainings, joint events, study and implementation of the best practices, and there is something that we may solve by drawing everyone's attention to it. Just keep saying something like, I respect you, I understand that you may be different, not like me, but my respect to you does not change, and based on this respect, mutual help, this is what we should build our coexistence on. And as an example of drawing such attention, I may mention communication campaigns, social videos that draw attention to this issue and they say that it's important. Thank you. It came up to my mind yet another group that could be subject to discrimination, but thanks to the fact that this group has an incredible ambassador, I'm talking about the servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine, a famous poet who issued a book, Pavlova Shibaba. Pavlova Shibaba is a vegetarian, and it was interesting to me how he could be treated where he is. He was in a very difficult spot since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but he says the attitude is fine. He says the volunteers help him to provide him with the meals that he needs, so it's a positive attitude, but he admits that it may not be the case everywhere, and he urges all of his colleagues, all of his vegetarian colleagues, to state this issue and to ask for help. But when you mentioned about the vulnerable groups, the vegans and vegetarians were stated as such groups. For example, they may not keep saying it all the time, but people said that if there is a vegan or vegetarian in my unit, so it's difficult to find proper meals for them based on their preferences. So this important attitude to their colleagues, brothers in arms, sisters in arms, the attitude to them is something that we have to learn how to do. Well, it's you know that that's a group that could be subject to discrimination, but they almost never talk about it. And then I want to give the floor to Ruslana Velychko-Trifonyuk, First Deputy Executive Director of the Ukrainian Veterans Center. And the first question to you will be, is it time to talk about discrimination and non-discrimination in the armed forces of Ukraine? As they say, is it proper time or not? I think that generally discrimination, stigmatization, and other expressions of certain attitude, they are always timely, because we have, or we can recognize that problems with the processing of the combatant or combat operations participant status, they influence the capabilities of the state. Yes, we can keep silent about this problem, but non-translation of certain thoughts, they don't change the real situation. We may say, as like within the last 2 days, I keep observing it during different public events, when people talk about the problems of the veterans and servicemen, about something that's gonna happen after the victory, but those problems already exist. For example, the veterans, they keep coming back now. This category already exists and the problems already exist. This is why we have to pay attention to what is said by the people who defend their country for the time being. And we have to start doing audit of our government services right now. Because if our country is demonstrating this attitude right now, very soon we will have very serious problems with the morale. Well, the next question then will be such. Ukrainian Veterans Fund, it's not the first research for you. There was a lot of research done before. So What happens next to the data of the research? You process them, you offer them to the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Office of the President, Ministry for Veteran Affairs, People's Deputies. To what extent people who have opportunities to influence, to amend the legislation or policies, to what extent do they listen to you? Well, all of our researches, we communicate them until the very last letter. We keep talking about that. We disseminate our studies, but I don't know whether through research, through our research, or due to the fact that it has been changed because otherwise it would not work. Still, we may observe during, for example, about the presentation of our previous results, we were talking about the electronic queues, we were talking about the medical commissions, the reintegration of the medical forces in the joint information systems, and we see it's happening now. This is why I'm very happy that we somehow managed to, thanks to perception by our government officials or other decision makers, they accept the realities of today. They understand that there is no other way it would work, or thanks to the fact that it's being communicated a lot, and it's a huge plus because the people hear us, so the things change. I'm very happy to recognize that the things are changing, and we're talking about these periods starting from January, and now it's May. Oh, I apologize, it's June. Well, in your opinion, talking about the problems of discrimination, what would you segregate? What is a discrimination against which groups is something that is very visible to you, and what can be done using the resources that the state wills for the time being? Well, I would rather draw your attention to the problem of discrimination of the widows, of stigmatization of widows. So it's not condolences, it's stigmatization. Why? Yes, we have to do a more detailed research about that. Why is it stigmatization? But let's be honest, our society is not concentrated in Kiev, and the majority of the widows, they are in the regions, in the western regions, small towns, villages, and let's recognize that our society in certain places is still patriarchal, and in the legislation, for example, it's written that a widow who lost the close ones, they survived this, and if they, God forbid, marry for the second time, if they start living second life, they are going to be deprived of that status. And I think it's worth considering a situation. If they marry for the second time, they may be deprived of some exceptions, some benefits, but the status, well, that's a huge question. We cannot delete something that people went through from their memories, from their emotional memories. And if other countries work on psychological support, if other countries work on making it somehow that those young women, because now they're young girls, they could continue their lives, in our legislation it says, God forbid, very strictly. Thank you for this remark. That's a whole topic for a different discussion, because now we're talking about the discrimination in the armed forces of Ukraine, where there's the attitude of the civilians and military. But this topic that you mentioned is very important. I recall the story of Mikhailina Skorik, who is the deputy of the mayor of Bucha, and how she was publicly persecuted due to her widowship status, as many people were thinking she was not a widow for long enough. She dared to bear a child and to marry for the second time. So we have to, yes, make an instance of this attitude, of this behavior. So Lubomyr Mysiv, deputy director of Sociological group rating, I would like to ask you to limit yourself with 20 minutes, not more. Well, I will try to make it within shorter time. I know that this research was already published and before this event. Generally, I would like to give you just an idea of the research, because Svitlana already told about it. The idea was not new, the idea was in the air, so to say. And when we decided to discuss the research itself, for us as the researchers, it was incredibly interesting because it's a new experience. Those are the categories of people with whom we didn't work in our practice. We are not specialists in the issues of discrimination itself, and we had to engage other experts for this research, but the conclusion is the same. This is the most interesting research in our practice because it's not about the number of problems. They were at the surface. A lot of things were discussed already since 2014 and since the intensification, specifically as to the role of the women in the armed forces. So there was nothing new about that. However, what we discovered that there are other groups that may be subject to discrimination, and there are problems that we have to recognize because this is something that we will be facing in future. So we focused on a number of key things, key groups that may be subject to discrimination. During our research, we identified yet another group as an idea that really worked. So the research consists of two parts. First, it was questioning back in March on a national level. So we asked their citizens about their opinion, what groups may be subject to discrimination, how do they see this problem. And another part of the research was in conversation with the military, those who may be subject to discrimination. So we had those categories: servicemen, female service persons. We had LGBT community representatives who are in the ranks of the armed forces for the time being. We have to thank the LGBT armed forces community for their support. Those are very interesting conversations that we used to have, and we are curious about the attitude of the society to this category of the servicemen, and we segregated such category as the wives of the servicemen. So we're not talking about the widows, but the girls, the young girls, in fact, whose husbands are now in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine, who fulfill their duties there. And in our case, it's a group that will require a further research. So it's not about discrimination, but it's about the problems that this category is facing. I won't focus my attention on some very detailed things. I think that a lot of things were said already, but the conclusion is general. So there is an attitude to certain categories of population, and there is an attitude in the armed forces to certain categories. So if we don't mention it as the armed forces, it changes the attitude to the person as an individual, as a personality. For example, beyond armed forces, if we ask what is your attitude to such categories as LGBT or former prisoners, former convicts, there will be a difference in perception of different categories. We understand that the most sensitive topic is LGBT. Now it's more like neutral positive. The negative becomes less, but it's not a drastic change that we would like to see. It takes more time. As soon as you add armed forces of Ukraine, the attitude changes dramatically, because anybody who is on service now gets some positive attitude regardless of their nationality, their sex orientation, their politic outlook. We can see it even on this slide. The attitude to those people is mostly positive or positive and neutral. So it changes the focus when we talk about the civilians. Talking about the military keeps saying one thing: those who stand by our side are our friends and brothers and sisters. So it's not about this attitude of the equal ones, but it's about the attitude by the commanders. And we were talking separately with the commanders and the privates, because those are two different worlds. The private, they can make jokes, they may have certain conflicts inside, but it's not a question of drastic discrimination. So everything regarding discrimination, whether it's about LGBT or the former convicts or the women, it depends a lot on the commander. Depending on the attitude of the commander, the attitude inside the group will be shaped. So we have to pay attention to this category, depending on how the commander can arrange the communication inside the unit and to implement the principles of work with those people. The rest of the group will take their attitude. Okay, so before we digress, as a sociologist, what is your opinion? Why is it different, the attitude inside the groups and attitude by the commanders? It's a complicated issue because it's both about sociological and psychological story. In my opinion, the commanders, they are the people of certain psychological type. They have to make decisions, they take responsibility, and it's easier for them to work with those whom they understand better. If they don't understand those people, there is certain psychological distance and social distance, and specifically under conditions of warfare, it becomes easier to talk to someone who is closer to you. And also it depends on the ideological narrative. So for example, strict nationalistic views, they are equal to the discrimination. So if we continue talking about LGBT representatives, they were very profound interviews. We were talking eye to eye without group talks, because you may touch a lot of other topics. You can talk more profoundly. For example, they say we're not being accepted by the air assault forces. We cannot talk about our orientation there openly. We didn't mention it in our research, but we had commanders who expressed very homophobic news, openly homophobic. Well, and sometimes people were open, and sometimes we had psychologists who could identify this homophobia in them. This is our explanation. It definitely requires more profound research, and psychologists will probably do better job there. Maybe it's a matter of education, our institutes, well, we understand that we have to start with education, but as the practice demonstrates on a practical level, there are people with different educational levels, and like simple folk, they treat different categories of population in a very simple manner, way they were more accepting than people with higher education like commanders and some others. So I will touch upon some key moments regarding the women in the army. For example, we were asking both civilians and the women who are in the ranks of the armed forces, and then the men who were in the armed forces, and all those three opinions, they coincide. They say in this one phrase, there are more women in the army, and all those problems, they start going outside. It all started back in 2014 when women started serving in the armed forces in the positions that were kind of unofficially prohibited for the women before. All those issues were discussed with the Ministry of Defense before, but for the time being we start talking about it more actively. It's an active phase of the war, and it all comes to the surface. So the key problems with the understanding of discrimination in the society, it's about what is discrimination itself. Is it suppression when people are not being allowed to do something? No, it's a different story. There is a positive discrimination. For example, when you're not being allowed to do some type of work because you're not being perceived as a person who can do such type of work, like a woman, for example. Well, the views are changing, but not so dramatically. I was talking about this when I was presenting the first research. The women, specifically the young ones, they understand what is sexism, but when you talk to elder ones, they don't understand it. We have a joke, like the girls are like the stars in the skies. You see, it all comes to one key issue: the maternity, the role of the mother, which is accepted in this, which is perceived in the society as a saint person, sacred person. That's a myth in Ukrainian national perception. So this is the secret of success there. If we understand that maternity is not the key role of a woman in their lives, but for the time being, unfortunately, well, maybe not unfortunately, because again, it depends. Let's try to be neutral. If a key role of a woman is being taken normally, so the role of a woman as a mother, the fact that it's not their main task to bear a child, well, it's still dominating in the society, and this is why they're being preserved so much in the army, that they can be bearing a child, and it results in a number of problems, starting from lack of professional growth. It's just some everyday issues like physical load, medical service, uniform, personal protective equipment, because military, for example, military medicine is not oriented at women at all. Well, Ruslana may tell you more about that. It's one of the biggest issues. Nobody knows anything about that. But again, there is another issue of psychological support. It's a tragedy in the army. Now we have to talk about this separately. So everyday problems, we understand it's social positive discrimination. The women take it normally that the men organize some separate bathroom for them, for example. But talking about communication, yes, there is problem, because if those women are by men's side, they want to talk about something, and it's good when they have some sisters-in-laws with whom they can talk, but sometimes they are just absent. But there is no problem with communication with the men, but it's about different topics of their life, because sometimes you want to talk about something that is closer to you. The men are mostly focused on their problems, so this problem exists, but it's just the problem of the number of men and women. For what I understand, there is now about 70,000 women in the armed forces, compared to 1 million of the total of the servicemen in the armed forces, service persons. So talking about some stereotypes were focused on the fact that the regular privates, even the men, let's put apart this, or let's put aside this maternity stereotype. We cannot do anything about this now. So attitude to those who are by your sides, that the women cannot fulfill some tasks, the privates, they take it in a different way. They understand that women can be commanders, the women are psychologically more resilient, are female medics, they demonstrate some incredible resilience, they show lives, and even the men themselves, they say that a man would not take this psychological load. But as to the women, there is a legend, a myth that exists since the Soviet times. It exists until now. There is certain bias among the commanders regarding the women. They think that women are redundant. There is such thing, yes. I simplify it, obviously, because during the war it should be quick and clear, so it's a communication barrier, and we have to work about it. As to the career growth of the women, no, it's a wrong slide. Women has to keep proving that they can be service persons. They have to work more to prove that yes, they can, because army is a closed system. It's a male environment, but if the commander is normal, everything works and there are no problems about this. We were talking separately about the sexual harassment, sexual violence. Unfortunately, this is not being discussed openly. We had no such people in our groups, but such cases just were buried somewhere in those units, and so that they don't get any further development. But we know that such cases exist. Well, another topic is national minorities. That's the least problem, because even among those groups that can be subject to discrimination, they are not on any serious level, because everybody who is by your side, who is serving by your side, they are your brothers and sisters. It goes without saying. A different situation is with the civilians, like for example Belarusians, Russians. They are being taken with a lot of caution, and in the army, if you are Russian, Belarusian or Azerbaijani, you're our brother, and still you are the same as us. For example, we measured one stereotype. If a non-Ukrainian can be commander over Ukrainians, among the civilians this stereotype is being taken without some positive attitude, more of as a negative phenomena. For example, if a non-Ukrainian can command Ukrainians, they think that there may be conflicts among the representatives of different national minorities in the military units. So it does not, this stereotype does not exist in military in private, but it exists among military commanders. For example, if a person joins the armed forces of Ukraine, they are your brothers and sisters. So another issue is LGBT. The different problems may be communicated here. The problems of coming out. For example, in the society, the attitude changed more to neutral, because the war equalizes everything, because the problems, all those problems, they go to the background, and the perception of the people who serve becomes positive. I cannot guarantee that it will be the same after the victory, because the society is patriarchal and conservative in many things. And as to the issue of the body, expatriation of the body, it's been perceived normally in the society. And the LGBT service persons, you know, there are issues of forced coming out or non-forced coming out. Many people just don't mention it, their sexual orientation, but sometimes they have to pronounce it to relieve a lot of problems, to avoid some blackmailing. So this problem exists not only in such system as Armed Forces of Ukraine, it exists in the society, but in the armed forces it's more on the surface. So there is jokes, there is some psychological pressure, but again, it depends on the commander. There is no discrimination in terms of salary, in terms of career growth. So on the first stage of perception, you know, the attitude may be negative, but as the service goes, you know, all those borders, they just disappear. There are no conflicts or even differences between the brothers in arms. I understand I'm running out of time. Well, but you tell it so interestingly. Well, I just want to draw your attention to the problem that we already touched upon. It's one of the questions that may arise further on, but it's about the issue of psychological support. It was very visible during the communication with the group of the females. We had the social workers from Armed Forces of Ukraine, and the problem is that there is no normal psychological support in the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The men cannot bear this psychological burden too. They need help too. And there is no culture of addressing the therapists. It's not only about the military, but we have a number of research is going out now. If you address a therapist, you're a psycho. Well, but it's only about the fact that you may talk about your problems, you may open your soul, but in the armed forces this is about the Soviet standards, about the questionnaires that have nothing to do with the reality. And it's not about only those who serve in the military, but it's about another group that we discussed, the wives of the servicemen, because they are the ones who need support every day. They spend waiting to become the widows, so they are under this psychological pressure every day. Now they have that support, but just as in the case of veterans, a little bit after the victory, no one will need them. And we have to understand that the big problem now are the salaries of the military, not about their size and disbursement. The problem is that they will not exist after the victory. This is what both the servicemen and their wives say. They understand that they risk their lives, they may perish, but they understand that their families started living better thanks to the increase of their salaries. They keep talking about that they could give something to their families, but they understand what they will be facing after the victory. There will be no jobs. They're afraid of that. They will not be perceived, they will not be accepted by those who will employ them. They will find no communication with those who were not serving. So it's about the psychology, not only the servicemen and their wives, but we have to accept the fact that we will have to live with that group further on, and the children of the servicemen. My son's friend's father just a month ago perished near Bakhmut. They are close to us. They are the people close to us. That boy, he's 11 years old. He lost his father, and you know, it's difficult to understand his situation when you're on a different side of the spectrum. So we tried to say that the post-war adaptation is #1 problem for the time being. So psychological load inside of the unit, the capability of communicating with the different groups, ability to set contact with different groups is psychology. This is what the army should work with. It would help us counter this serious problem. There is a separate blog in our study. Thank you for publishing these wonderful slides. Thank you for finding funding for this wonderful project. There are problems that we segregated from the point of view of the social attitude. I will not focus on that because we continue this research started from March, and we keep talking about those problems about the veterans, and obviously this is something that will need, well, what they need, #1 thing, to address the government. We fight for our state now, and their obligation will be to protect us after the war, because they're afraid of that. They're afraid what's gonna be next. They're not afraid of the enemy as much as what's gonna be next. I want to appreciate your attention. Like, for me, as one of those who was preparing this research, who was developing the questionnaires, it's 6 different areas of the research, and to cover them during such press conference, even reading this research, You may pick one line and follow it, but it's 6 different blocks of the research, so please continue researching. I hope this research will help at least start solving certain issues. Well, and I'm thinking how many different topics for the broadcast in Ukrainian radio. I will be in Ukrainian radio at 18:40 today. Thank you, Mr. Lubomyr. I would like to ask you, as a sociologist, how to spread those positive practices of non-discrimination that you've researched, that you've seen in the armed forces of Ukraine. There is no discrimination to the national minorities, for example, and less negative attitude to LGBT and to the women. How can we spread those practices on that part of the society who are not at the armed forces? How to preserve them? Those people who are afraid of future, can they bring those cultural practices into the society and to implement them? Can they say that we are all citizens of Ukraine, we all have our choice, we have to respect each other? To what extent do you think they may be ambassadors of this new culture? Yes, they can be ambassadors of this new culture, but I'm a bit skeptical in this regard, because we were discussing it with Tanya. We love figures, and when you look at the figures, you understand that it's a bit different. You have to understand that the group of the veterans, of the servicemen, that's one social group. They are isolated to a certain extent because they went through their experience and they have something to discuss, and between them they are taken positively by the society. And if information policy of the state is such that it will help that group to integrate in the society, but you know that it's a difficult thing. For example, when you go to a government institution for a certificate, you may end up either on the bridge or with an exploded grenade. So I would segregate this policy. Yes, the military, they can be ambassadors, but in the society you have to talk about it, about the overcoming of discrimination, about the perception of different groups that are not like you. It's more of an education issue, of a culture issue. I'm telling you right away, I don't think that the stereotypes change so dramatically. The war will expedite this process, because again, 1 million of people who went through this is not a problem that they would be carrying afterward. They will be more concerned with their social everyday problems. So in future, if we want to continue talking about eradicating discrimination, we have to work with the population as the whole. Then it will work. As the examples we may give the artists, the military, whoever can carry this message, the message of equality, and regardless of whom they love, what's their nationality, what they eat, they're still equal. So this is my opinion. Thank you very much. Let's work further on. Inviting Oksana Grigor'eva. Oksana Grigor'eva, gender advisor to the commander of the ground forces of the Ukrainian armed forces. Miss Oksana, first of all, I would like to ask you, so what is exactly the number of women who are in the armed forces and in the front lines specifically? It's important to know, because I'm not talking directly about the armed forces of Ukraine, because even among our conservative civilians, there is such an opinion that it's more about the PR, selfies, Instagram. There are no really women in the front lines. They create an additional budget load on the armed forces of Ukraine. Why would they be paid? Why would they be paid these high salaries if there is no use of them? Can you please tell us about this? And then I will ask my other question. Thank you very much. It's a very important topic. I want to thank everybody who completed this research, civil organizations, the fund, obviously, because this is something that we have to talk about on a daily basis. It's the topic of today, yesterday, and is the topic of our future. So thank you once again. I was captivated by your speech. I wanted to respond to each of the phrases of yours, to add just a couple of words, but that's probably a topic for a different conversation, because what you're saying now, the most people possible should know about it. They are not watching this broadcast, and they will not watch it, but we have to communicate it to them. We have to get people engaged. That's one thing. About the women in the army, it's about 62,000 of them in the army now. I can tell you for sure about the ground forces now. If I get this request, for example, in the armed forces, in the ground forces, we have 15,539 women, and in the front line, again, this is the details that I had recently, maybe 5,500 women. It's a big number for the front line. So talking about more than 5,000 women in the forward edge, and we know about the number of men there, but we don't disclose that number. But what we can say that it's a significant presence, and it's not only about Instagram and selfies. Obviously, we may say that there are different women in the front lines, because if you make your research before, that data would be different, because who is Ukrainian army today? Is the yesterday's civilians. We cannot say that that data is only about the army, because now, just in a year and a half, obviously those civilians, they mastered new skills, they have changed, but all the society has changed. Each and every of us has changed, but it's not the data about the armed forces, about the troop as such, because those are the civilians of yesterday, and they keep coming from their civilian lives, and they take offices, they take positions with the army. And it's important that you're saying that everything depends on the commander. It's absolutely right, but there are different commanders, and they are not always the staff military who were studying the military profession for years and years. They are, for example, yesterday's reserve officers. But you know how it was happening. Someone was taking it seriously, and someone was taking it quite formally. It's no secret. We have to talk about it. And those people, they are commanders now too. So it's a very important question. The question of training of the commanders, of the personnel, of the sergeants. This category of the servicemen, of the officers who should know everything about this, are that private, and in principle to work on helping them, including with the psychological condition, because they're of value. I can tell you with 100% confidence that the commanders of the armed forces, including the ground forces, they care about their personnel. Obviously, it's very difficult with such a huge number of the military that we have now, after this year and a half, to create this vertical, to make sure that in every phase the commander or just an officer fulfills their functions according to the field manual, because many of them, they're not even familiarized with the field manual. But we have to get the civil organizations involved. A lot of people from civil life, they came with their colossal skills, and I always urge the military to listen what those yesterday's civilians say. You know, those Soviet standards, they still exist in the army. As like I I am a boss here and you just came here to make some money. But it's not so. People came from the civil lives not for the salaries. They were making way more in their civilian lives. I'm not talking about everybody, because some did come for the salary, but some people were managing some, I don't know, thousands of people. They were doing something useful, and now they came to the army to do something useful there. We have to keep talking about this, and for the time being, you know, there is such a positive discrimination, as we mentioned, for different types of different categories of population, because, you know, the men are being mobilized, so they're being discriminated more. Women enlist voluntarily. We had two waves, one in 2014 or after 2014, and another part they came in the February and March last year. Well, some of them, they retire already, some have small kids, and for example, when a couple get enlisted, a married couple, and they have kids, one of them can retire. So now it's more stable flow, but you know, the most part of the women they came back then. Well, Miss Oksana, but is this discrimination visible? Well, I'm sure it exists, but how does this problem reflect during the appointment of the women to the commanders' positions? Well, it did not start today. I have to say that the move with the discrimination happened back in 2018, when women were allowed to take all the positions, all the officer and sergeant positions. Before the 2018, our women who enlisted in 2014, they were perfect snipers, because they used to be biathlonists before, and they had to be appointed to the positions of the, say, cooks, because in the legislation it did not say that women can take some combat positions, and it envisages different benefits, different attitudes. For example, you cannot be awarded as a sniper because you're a cook according to your position. That's a different thing. So that's a titanic move which happened thanks to the civil organizations. It happened in 2018 and it was legally adopted, and now in 2022 the women started going for training, and if they had experience they could pick up the positions for themselves. And as to the female commanders, that's a very important issue, because back in 2018 the women were allowed to study all the military professions. They had not right to study for military professions. Why don't we have female commanders? Why we only have 2 female generals? Because they were not able to study certain military professions, and in 2018 they were allowed to. In 2019 there was the first entrance, first admission, and now they graduate, so now they can proceed to the service and take the commanders' positions, because obviously the commanders are not being appointed no matter whether it's a man or woman. You can be appointed as a commander if you're a non-commissioned officer, even if you are a PhD, but if you have no military profession, you have no military rank, you cannot be a commander. Now it's allowed, but you have to sign a contract. So those are legislative things that we have to continue talking about. So again, with time, obviously, we will see this growth too. And we will have many women in the commanders' positions, and I think it will be positive. One positive example, if you allow me.
В той підрозділ, де жінка командир. Ну, я розумію, що жінки різні, але оцей
How good is it to appoint a woman as a commander and to go to serve to that unit where a woman is a commander, because the women, they have this maternity instinct. You know, Tatiana Chernobol, she's civil activist, former People's Deputy. She's a commander of artillery unit now. So she was telling me she's an officer. When she was a People's Deputy, she obtained higher military education, and she says that you have to take a lot more effort to become a commander, to preserve that position. And what happens next? You have to plan an operation. And she says, I realize that since I'm a woman, to force my subordinates to fulfill that order, which is related to the risk to their lives, I have to go to the position myself. And they follow me because they understand I'm not planning any adventure, because I'm not planning any lies, because I'm going there by myself. And as a female commander, she's incredibly proud by the fact that she has no casualties or serious injuries in her unit, because she, as a woman, as a mother to two children, she appreciates human lives a lot. Maybe this is something personal, something individual, but I think that she's an interesting story that can be researched. You want to react? But right away I will ask you another question about the Istanbul Convention. The Parliament ratified it. Like you know, here we ratified, here we close our eyes, but the document is in place in the legislative field of Ukraine. You've seen the results of this research. To what extent can the Istanbul Convention help improve these results, to decrease the expressions of discrimination, to remove them as an instrument, as a tool, as a law that is in effect in Ukraine? Well, I will tell you about the units where the commanders are female. They're almost the same everywhere. For example, the men were in those units that are commanded by females, the men try to be better. You know, I was going around the places, around the positions. You know, there is more order where commanders are female. Where there is a female in a unit, they know, regardless of their position, they act as psychologists, they advise, and the men appreciate it. And they don't want to let them go on missions, because if they lose a woman, I'm sorry, the losses are not as big among women as among men, but they go through this loss with a lot of difficulty. But there is a category of women who can lead a platoon after themselves, and their number will grow. And there's yet another thing. I've seen a lot of women from my previous life. We were holding events in different NATO members' military bases. We were visiting different NATO facilities, military facilities, and I was surprised by the fact that women there are no different from men. I remember in the States, like there was a girl, very small, maybe 150 tall. She took that backpack, which was twice bigger than her. I couldn't even lift it, but she just took it on her shoulder, and she left. So a lot of attention there is being paid to physical training. And you touched upon the topic of education. We have to start it from the kindergarten, from the school. We don't have enough physical training for the men and women, and it's separated. Here the girls do push-ups, the boys do pull-ups. So there is no such segregation in other countries. You just pick your standards. For example, you want to do this or that, no matter whether you are a boy or a girl. They are being educated from their childhood that they are equal. They don't segregate it, that this is a male and this is a female profession. So we're moving this way only now. We have, again, those tectonic moves haven't happened just now. Sometimes women cannot do something that is physically difficult for them. They cannot pull some loads, they cannot lift something, but hypothetically they can be a soldier of that unit. So yes, we have to pay more attention to the physical training, but what's more important is professionalism. No matter who you are, man or woman, no matter what's your sexual orientation, what's your confession, what's your nationality, if you're a professional, believe me, you will be respected by everyone. I know a lot of their minorities, I communicated with them. If you're a professional, you're respected by everyone. You're being treated normally, you're being awarded and glorified. So it all depends on your loyalty and professionalism. As to the Istanbul Convention, it's not only about the military, but it's about the society in general. It's aimed at the protection of women who are subject to the home violence, and it's incredibly important because not like now, but it's about what happens next when the guys go back home. And there is a case now that when they go on vacation, now their wives telephone us, and us as a gender advisors, they call us and they say, we don't understand it. We don't understand each other. The servicemen themselves, they call me, they say, well, I just want to lie down and she wants to talk. So everyone is angry, and the domestic violence erupts. This is something that Istanbul Convention can help us with. How can we have to talk about how we can use it in this particular case, but it's an important, very important document. It was promoted for a long time before it was adopted but in terms of gender equality, Ukraine already won all the anti-discrimination efforts. The other thing is to what extent it is complied with, because we have to remind our society, no matter how good we say it is, that the women express themselves, there is less discrimination, but still we have to keep reminding about this, because something that was given to the men since their birth, the women have to fight for it. Unfortunately, until now, our society is not yet ready to the fact that the women can be just equal with the men, equal opportunities, equal rights. And it's also about the LGBT, about other minorities. It's not only about the army, it's about the scale of the problem on the level of the public. Thank you very much. We have another speaker, Yuliya Kirillova, veteran, Ukrainian Veterans Fund analyst, and we will talk about the discrimination, and counter-discrimination of the military with the injuries. What should be the cultural practices? What should be the policies of the government? How to find the golden middle between how to find the balance between the condolences and the respect to those veterans who want to get back to their civil lives or even back in service. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the question. You know, this topic in our society is very pressing, you know, because we have a lot of defenders, both men and female, who get injured. And those are very different injuries. There are visible and non-visible injuries. So talking about the people with disabilities today, unfortunately, it's not only those people who have some visible disabilities like amputation or some scars, some bruises. We have a huge number of invisible consequences that the war leaves on the psyche, on the health of our veterans, members of their families, and society in general, because now the majority of Ukrainians somehow somehow feel the consequences of the war and are the participants of this war to a certain extent, because the incessant rocket attacks that are going on a daily basis, they are happening in our conditionally peaceful cities as well. And even today we have a huge number of the veterans, of the defenders with injuries. There is a huge number of children who suffered it. They have visible consequences of them. So talking about the policies related to veterans, we have to touch upon other categories of population too, other categories of our society, which are also affected by the war. And if we start developing high quality policies in this area, the policies in this with regard to the veterans, the stereotypes and the policies in the society, they will change too, because I'm a veteran too myself. I have a disability, and many of my sisters in arms, they were injured too, but those are invisible consequences. And we communicated with, we met recently, we were communicating, and one of my friends, she said, I underwent the medical commission recently once again, and when I came there, they asked me, what's your disability? Look at yourself in the mirror, you don't look disabled at all. So if people look normal, the society, they don't perceive them as disabled, because they don't see what's going on inside, what's going on with their body, what's going on with their psyche. So I thought that it was only me who heard it, because I've heard the same words. Have you seen yourself in the mirror? And it's very painful to see something like that, because when people ask, why are you so dissatisfied with the medical services, psychological rehabilitation, recreation facilities, yes, it's true. Now those institutions, they don't cope with the number of the injured due to the huge load. They don't cope with that huge number of people who require this rehabilitation. But we have not to forget about the quality of the services. It should be on the extraordinarily high level, because yesterday, today and tomorrow those people will continue risking their lives. They will continue giving away the most valuable things, their lives and health. They will risk their families, because as many speakers mentioned today, it influences their families. It's not only veterans who changed, but the whole society. And when we talk about reintegration, it's discrimination. The fact that we say that the veterans should be reintegrated into the society is the discrimination itself, because the society was changing during that period, and the veterans who originate from the peaceful society, they stay at the same level. They are developing as the military, as participants of combat operations. They get back to the same society. They don't understand what was happening, because it's about isolation. You spend a year or half a year in the rotation, you spend some time in the polygon, you don't understand what was going on, what changed. People come back, and really sometimes they divorce, and a lot of our defenders, they sacrifice a lot, they lose a lot. And so today we have to make researches like this. We have to study not only some specific problems, some specific situations, but we have to formulate, we have to articulate the problem, and we have to work out a number of solutions, not only information campaigns, or that we will talk to the society, to the community, and we have to overcome the stereotypes. The problem is really way more broad. It's not only in the heads of our society. Many problems, they are not even being pronounced. For example, like problems of the people with disabilities. Many people talk about the amputees, but we don't talk about people who require permanent attention, about those who are in need of a permanent care, those who cannot stand up from their beds. Those problems are not being discussed, for example, not that I've heard about that, and it's important to pay attention to such researches as ours. So I urge everybody to pay attention now, because it's impossible to create high quality policies based on one problematic situation that was only discussed in the media. You have to continue digging, you have to continue researching. It should have sociological, psychological component. We have to engage different stakeholders. For example, we engage the ministry, but we don't ask the target audience, how else can we help, what else do you need, or what don't you need, do you really need this policy? Because previously I was paying my attention when some changes were implemented. They were implemented based on the international experience, but nobody ever analyzed to what extent was that experience successful, or to what extent can this experience be translated into Ukrainian realities. There was too little approbation. It was happening very rarely, so we have such problems so far, and it's important to have studies like this. We want to thank NAKO for their support. We want to say the group for their support, because we're moving in the right direction, it seems to me. Thank you very much, Miss Yuliya. Thank you for defending us. Thank you. And Svitlana Musiyaka from NAKO, she has another video, for what I understand. Yes, it's to finalize our discussion before we proceed to Q&A session. I would like to get back to what I used to say in the very beginning and what was said by the speakers. It's very similar. We have to base our activities on the research. I want to thank again our colleagues from Ukrainian Veterans Fund, Sociological Group Rating. Together with NAKO, we were able to make this research. It's not the first and not the last one. We did it within the framework of a project in coordination with the Special Defense Advisor of the Embassy of the Great Britain, but we should focus on the issue how to satisfy the needs of our veterans and service persons to the maximum extent. There is no single solution. We have to keep working with the analysts, with the policies, but we have also to continue working with our society through communication campaigns. And I would like to recall a communication campaign that we were developing with the Ukrainian Veterans Fund. The main idea was that the veterans are different and the victory is one. And within this campaign we made a video, and if we have such a technical opportunity, can we launch it? Full-fledged life is hands, legs, no, it's the aspiration, it's the will, it's the movement forward. Love, funding, future, is the dream, the victory, pride and respect, with respect to those who make Ukraine stronger. A wonderful video. I'm almost about to break in tears. I want to thank everybody who was involved in creation of this video. We have to broadcast it in the national marathon. Dear colleagues, it's time for questions. Maybe we have online questions. If you can tell us how can we have questions from our audience? Yes, please. The question. Artem Denisov, good afternoon. Veteran Hub Organization Director, thank you very much for this presentation. It was long but interesting. What's the difference from other meetings? It was also interesting, not only long. So regarding the research, I have a couple of questions and a personal reaction. So first, personal reaction. I want to say, I just want to pronounce it. It says there respect versus discrimination, but we're living in the conditions of the full-scale invasion. We don't have this versus. Unfortunately, we have both respect and discrimination. We have a full-scale war and the martial law, and some of our constitutional rights are limited. Is it discriminational? Yes. Is it there are circumstances of war? Yes. For example, we cannot talk about discrimination in the country because women were able to leave the country during the full-scale invasion, but not the men because they have to stay in the country to defend it. But it's okay, in my opinion. But the government, as the institution, stated it in official level, so it's okay. So let's go further. So when you say that the women, they have this maternity instinct, they preserve the unit, so I think it's discriminational. It's the commander who preserves the unit because the lives of the fighters are of value to the commander. I was associated with a unit which was commanded by a woman, and it was her merit as a commander, not as a woman, to take the right decisions, and it was not dependent on any other social roles that she was playing. So her compliance with her duties, that was something that was guiding the unit. That was what was fundamental, because first you were saying that they may be single cases, but generally, well, I agree. It was my non-professional remark, but the professionals here, they don't commit mistakes like this, and I do. Yeah, just without judging, we have to find communication. You know, first we have to come to terms and definitions, and it's good we can do this. Well, regarding the questions, I had two questions. Miss Yuliya touched upon a serious topic that I may have not have gotten familiarized with, but regarding two target audiences that were not covered in veteran and military topics, so people with disabilities and with injuries who continue their service, and they're being subject to the discrimination when they're being put outside the staff, for example, or when they cannot, for example, take part in battle operations de jure, but they do de facto. The people with disabilities, they have previous combat experience, they formally should not be involved in this full-scale invasion. They were undergoing the medical commissions, and they were getting this accepted stamp to go to the front line. So this is a huge problem, really. Please get me right. Now that the war is on and we have limited resources, and we have very limited resources now, vegetarian meals are very important component, but the issue of the efficient fund spending, for example, where we forward those financial resources, and people with disabilities, they are also in the ranks not only of the armed forces but of the National Guard. They come in very big numbers, and it's a serious problem in the units when inside the unit there is yet another subunit created where all those cripples, as they say, where they go, and it's a very big depreciation of their dignity. And the official coverage of this category and the discrimination of this category in the public field does not sound a lot. In informal speaking, there's a lot of communication about this. Thank you for this question. I'm having another question for the time being. Well, let me react your first remark regarding the discrimination, men and women. The legislation does not discriminate them by gender. It was not discrimination by gender. There are women who were obliged to serve, and they were not let outside the country. There is no such segregation. It's just that there are people who are subject to the military service are not. It's legislative, and some categories they can leave the country even regardless of their gender. And your second question, we were talking about that too, and we were emphasizing that this research includes 6 different topics. Ukrainian Veterans Fund, it has a lot of analytics, and I invite you to visit our office, visit our events, because we were visiting yours. Please visit our website, the analytics section of it. We researched this issue. It was there. It will be issued a little bit later, and we continue to study those issues, but sometimes you cannot fit everything in one research, because it's not going to be a research like you said. It was long, but it was something essential. It will be some big legal dictionary, you know. So yes, we researched that issue. If you visit our website, its analytics section, you may get familiarized with the complex researches, and it's covered there. Thank you. Well, your second question, well, I would like to react first. Well, there is a research, but there is reality. Like what you presented today, there should be no discrimination in the army, but it still exists. And in the same way, I'm asking this question. No, I'm just not agreeing with what you're saying, that there is some discrimination of men. I cannot agree with this. I can express my opinion in compliance with the legislation. The military-bound individuals are not allowed to leave the territory of Ukraine, not men or women, but the military-bound. Okay, let's proceed to the second question, because probably there may be more. Well, then the question will be with regard to the indefinite future, something that you were saying before. The people who are somehow associated with the armed forces, when people retire, when they switch to the veteran status, they lose this identification status, and it results in this indefinition in the future. So my question was, in fact, there was an expression today, veterans policy, it was mentioned. So do you plan to add this research to the development, I mean, as it's finalized, of this joint government policy for the veterans of the Russian-Ukrainian war? Like, category of those whom we identify as the veterans of the war, not like a general status veterans. Because unfortunately, a big part of the legislation since post-Soviet times, there is a huge number of individuals who are equalized with the veteran status, but those who have combat experience. And what will be the further coordination, something that should be covered by this policy? How does the state coordinate their policy? Well, what's going to happen to those people next? Are they going to become the instructors? Are they going to go to reserve, one turn reserve turn tier 1, reserve tier 2? So who's your question to? Well, that I think that lady who was a representative of the Ministry for Veterans Affairs, let me ask. There is a term in the legislation, the veteran of war, because you're saying about the people with the battle experience. I would like to say that in our case, people with battle experience are the veterans of, say, Afghan war and different peacekeeping operations. They have battle experience too. So this is why we have to segregate it here, that there is a veteran of war and the veterans who retire earlier. If we take this segregation very drastically, and if we segregate them, so those two terms in compliance with the Ukrainian legislation, they have different, I don't like the word benefits, it's a terrible word, but let's say, yeah, different benefits. The legislation is in place since 1993. It should be amended because it's not in accord with the reality. It's like wire phones, the queue, those people are supposed, or they are entitled to the extra queue service in the mess halls. I don't see how is it relevant to our reality today. And this legislation is supposed to be adopted regarding the Operations Reserve 1 and Operations Reserve 2. It's up to the Ministry of Defense. It's not the job of the Ministry for Veterans Affairs. And regarding the Operations Reserve 1 and Operations Reserve 2, I think it was legally implemented. I mean, the legal amendments were adopted in 2021, and it was upon the initiative of the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of for Veterans Affairs. They developed the draft law, and I would like to emphasize that they rely upon all those details. We hand them over those details way before we publish them, and if those draft laws would be based on the data, it says government funds, because some benefits are not even necessary, but still I would like to say that there is constitution, and in accordance with the constitution you cannot take something from a person which is given to them. This is why it's a very interesting topic, and here I would say we need some legal creativity, because, for example, if someone goes to the Constitutional Court, the draft law is being recognized non-constitutional, and I think this is not something that you or other veterans want or I want. So this segregation, if we have this veteran status according to the certificate of the participant of battle operations, and if that battle experience was obtained during peacekeeping operations or during the war in Afghanistan or now, because if we take the reality, there are family members of those who perished before the 24th of February, and there are family members of those who perished after, and they are not equal to. So I think that separating Ukrainian society is not something that's worth to be done. Yeah. The society should be united. I know a lot of people who are, for example, the participants of the battle operations in Afghanistan, and they keep serving now. So let's not separate the society. We had this before, East and West, and we all see what it resulted in. We can see it with our own eyes. In the Constitution, the people, well, it's in the Constitution, it says that the human being is of greatest value, and we cannot say that there are people who were taking part in battle operations and something who perished, and these are better than those. This policy will not end in something good, because we remember how the Ukrainian insurgent army veterans were limited in their rights, and it was a very wrong policy that separated the Ukrainian people. And before we start doing all of it, we have to first refer to the sociological questioning of all of the society, and to see how they react to this, because the separation of the society, it's something that should be measured across the whole of Ukraine. Ms. Ruslana, thank you. I'm just going to call your name, Oksana Grigor'eva, gender advisor to the commander of the ground forces of the armed forces of Ukraine. Well, the issue that you're touching upon, there is no such a big issue of discrimination or sexual harassment. The most of the issues is related to the payments. As Ms. Ruslana said, it's the Ministries of Defense for Veteran Affairs, social policies. They're the ones who should work in order not to segregate by financial indicators, not to tell one veterans from others, and those injured individuals who are beyond the staff. This is not fair, because the people, they laid their health, they were paid in a different manner, and now when we put them beyond the staff, in fact they don't work with the armed forces, but they are still not being provided by the benefits by the Ministry of Veterans Affairs, at least to the extent of the salaries that they were getting. It may not be visible, but they are traumatized. We have to keep talking about this. We have to continue demanding. It's a normal practice to continue demanding. Is the normal indicator of the democratic society. When people start talking about it, there are moves in this direction. People have to be protected. They have to continue getting normal jobs, worthy jobs, on the level of those salaries that they receive with the armed forces of Ukraine. Well, regarding the employment and the salaries, I will rush a little bit ahead. We're having this research now about the desires, the level of education of our future veterans, and we measure the market, starting from the small businesses to the big ones. We try to unite these two parallel worlds to find the points of contact, to equalize the problems of the expectation and what the market can offer. So we invite you on the 27th of June for the event like this. Thank you. Just a small remark, so I'm not being accused of the segregation and separation. I was not saying about the segregation of experience, but I was talking about it for trivial reasons. To make sure that the requirements of the target group are being efficiently satisfied, we have to first segregate it. This is why I mentioned it in a way I did. I'm not saying it should be the responsibility of the Ministry for Veterans Affairs to develop this joint national policy, and segregating of the veterans of the Russian-Ukrainian war, it's not only to glorify them. I have my personal opinion, but it's not related to the operational procedures and processes to satisfy the needs of this or that group. We have to study those needs, and for that we have to segregate them. For this reason, the veterans of the Russian-Ukrainian war, as we mentioned today, they may fulfill different social roles before they joined the war in 2014, and they may have battle experience too, and it's about the needs that they may have as a result of their participation in the war, in this war. So based on the reserves that are in place since 2014, all those researches, they show that those needs will be different from other social groups, other veterans that we used to have in Ukraine before. So I'm not talking about comparing their experiences or segregation, but it's okay to compare the experience, but not to evaluate it. Well, maybe someone else has any more questions to our speakers, and online questions. I don't know whom I'm actually asking now, but do we have any online questions? If we do, please let us know. If there are no questions, so let's thank all of our speakers and everybody who visited us. Within these last 2 hours, you demonstrated your attention and interest. I wish everybody has a peaceful and quiet day, and see you during our following events.